I remember the exact moment the dining room went quiet. My fiancé's mother, Patricia Holloway, a retired nursing supervisor with 32 years at Hamilton General behind her, was halfway through explaining to me how the healthcare system had gone wrong. She had one hand resting on the white linen tablecloth, her wine glass untouched, and she was speaking slowly the way people do when they believe the person across from them simply doesn't have the background to keep up. "The problem," she said, "is that hospitals keep promoting people based on credentials on paper. A title doesn't mean you understand patients. That kind of judgment, that instinct, it takes decades to develop. You either have it or you don't." The table went still after that. My fiancé, James, shifted slightly in his chair beside me. His father, Robert, looked down at his plate with the practiced expression of a man who had learned to wait out these moments. I set down my fork, folded my hands in my lap, looked across the table at Patricia, and said very quietly, "I think you're right that instinct matters. It's something I try to bring into the operating room every single day. I'm the new head of cardiac surgery at St. Michael's." Nobody moved. Patricia blinked once, slowly, like someone trying to recalibrate something that had suddenly stopped making sense. But to understand how we arrived at that moment, how a Sunday dinner in Oakville became the most uncomfortable evening of Patricia Holloway's retirement, you have to go back a few weeks. I had just been appointed department head at 32 years old. The announcement came through officially in late September, and even I had to sit quietly with it for a few minutes before it felt real. St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto is not a small place. The cardiac surgery program there carries a reputation across the country, and stepping into that role at my age was the kind of thing that gets written up in hospital newsletters and occasionally attracts a few raised eyebrows from colleagues twice my age. I had spent the better part of a decade working toward it: residency, fellowship, 2 years as attending surgeon, and then the department head search that I honestly hadn't expected to win. But I did. The paperwork was signed. My name was on the office door, and the quiet, relentless work of actually doing the job had already begun. What I hadn't expected was that the same week I started settling into that role, James would finally ask me to come home with him to meet his family. James and I had been together for almost 2 years. We met at a fundraising gala for the hospital foundation. He worked in urban planning for the city of Toronto, the kind of careful, methodical work that suited him perfectly. He was thoughtful and steady, the sort of person who asked good questions and actually listened to the answers. He knew what I did. He knew my hours, my stress, the way I sometimes came home after a 12-hour surgery and sat on the kitchen floor for a few minutes before I could take off my coat. He knew all of it. But somehow, in 2 years, the subject of meeting his parents had never quite landed. There was always a reason to postpone, a schedule conflict, a holiday that didn't work. I hadn't pushed. When he finally brought it up one evening in October, we were cooking dinner together in my condo in the east end of the city, the lake just barely visible through the kitchen window. "My mother's been asking," he said, not looking up from the cutting board. "That's fair," I said. "We've been together long enough." He nodded, but there was something in the pause that followed that made me set down what I was holding and look at him properly. "There's something I should probably tell you first," he said. I waited. He exhaled slowly. "My mother worked in nursing for over 30 years. She's very proud of that. She has opinions about medicine, about how it should work, who should be in charge, what makes a good clinician." "That's understandable," I said. "She also has opinions about young doctors." I raised an eyebrow. "She thinks the system promotes people too quickly these days, that hospitals prioritize optics over experience." He paused again. "She said some things about female surgeons specifically, about how the culture has shifted too fast." I looked at him for a moment. None of that was new to me. I had heard variations of it my entire career, in hospital corridors, at conferences, sometimes from patients who asked to speak to the doctor, and then looked past me to find someone else. I had learned to absorb it without letting it change the way I moved through a room. "And she doesn't know what you actually do," I said. It wasn't quite a question. James had the honesty to look embarrassed. "I told her you work in hospital administration." I stared at him. "I know," he said quickly. "I know how that sounds. But the last time I brought home someone in medicine, my mother spent the entire dinner quizzing her about clinical decisions, and it was a disaster. I wanted her to meet you first. As a person. Not as a resume." I understood the intention. I genuinely did. And I also understood that what he was describing was not a small misunderstanding, waiting to be cleared up over appetizers. He had shaped an entire story around me that bore almost no resemblance to my actual life. "James," I said carefully, "your mother retired from nursing. She volunteers somewhere, you've mentioned it. Where?" He looked at me. "St. Michael's, actually. The Cardiac Ward Auxiliary." I let that sit for a second. "She volunteers," I said, "in the department I now run." He closed his eyes briefly. I realized that is not ideal. It wasn't. But I had spent the last decade navigating situations that were not ideal, and I had learned that the worst thing you can usually do is walk into a room already braced for a fight. So I told him I would come to dinner. I told him I would meet his parents as exactly who I was, his partner, the person who loved him, and that whatever else came up would come up naturally. He looked relieved in the way people do when they've avoided a conversation they should have had much sooner. The drive to Oakville took about 40 minutes on a Sunday afternoon, through the gray-blue October light that spreads across the QEW in the fall, the lake glittering flat and cold to the south. The Holloways lived in a quiet neighborhood of older homes with large maples out front, most of them already bare by mid-October. The leaves raked into neat piles along the curb. James's parents' house was a 2-story brick colonial with a covered front porch and a Canadian flag above the door. Modest and well-kept in the way that speaks of people who take their property seriously and their neighborhood personally. James was quiet in the car for most of the drive. "You're nervous," I said. "A little," he admitted. "I'll be fine. It's not you I'm worried about." I smiled at that. "She's not going to like being corrected," he said. "She never does." "I'm not planning to correct anyone," I said. "I'm planning to have dinner." He glanced over at me. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. We're going to eat food and talk to people we care about. The rest we can handle as it comes." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he parked the car, and we walked up to the porch together. Patricia Holloway opened the door before we knocked. She was a trim woman in her early 60s with short silver hair and the upright posture of someone who had spent decades on her feet. She had warm brown eyes that immediately went to James with the specific softness mothers reserve for sons they don't see often enough, and then shifted to me with something considerably more measured. "You must be Claire," she said. "I am. It's lovely to meet you." Her handshake was firm and brief. "Patricia." She held the door open. "Come in, both of you, it's cold." James's father, Robert, appeared from the living room. He was a tall, easygoing man with a wide smile, and the relaxed manner of someone who had long ago made peace with taking up less space than his wife. He shook my hand warmly and immediately asked if I wanted tea, which I found endearing. The house smelled like roasting chicken and something baking, and the kitchen table was visible through the doorway, already set with cloth napkins and a small vase of dried autumn flowers. A worn copy of the Merck manual sat on the bookshelf in the hallway next to a framed certificate from Hamilton General Hospital, 30 years of dedicated service. I noticed it but didn't say anything. We moved into the living room while dinner finished. The conversation started pleasantly. Robert asked how James was settling into a new project at work. Patricia asked about where I grew up, and I told her about growing up in Halifax, and she mentioned that her own mother had been from Cape Breton, and for a few minutes things felt easy and genuine. But slowly, the way water finds its level, the conversation drifted toward medicine. It almost always does when someone in a room has given 30 years to it. Patricia mentioned a news story she had read about wait times in Ontario hospitals. She had strong opinions about the cause, which she attributed to administrative bloat and an overemphasis on technology over clinical judgment. Robert gently suggested the situation was complicated. Patricia gave him the patient look of someone who has been told this before and does not find it persuasive. "The issue," she said, settling back in her chair, "is that hospitals have become more interested in metrics than in patients. Numbers on a screen instead of people in a bed. That's a tension that's been there for a long time," I said. She looked at me. "You work in administration," James said. "Something like that," I said. Patricia nodded, apparently satisfied. "Then you'd know. The people running these programs now, they have the MBAs and the operational experience, but they've never actually stood at a bedside. They don't understand what the staff are going through." James put down his glass of sparkling water very carefully. "That's a fair concern in some contexts," I said. Patricia continued. "I see it every week when I volunteer. Protocols that make no sense on the ground. Decisions made by committees that have never set foot on a ward." She shook her head. And then you have these young physicians being pushed up the ladder faster than they have any right to be, because the hospital wants to look progressive, and the patients are the ones who pay for it. Robert cleared his throat quietly. James looked at the window. I do think experience matters enormously, I said. Patricia seemed pleased by that. Exactly. 30 years ago, you earned your position. You didn't get handed a department because you had the right demographics and a good publication record. Mom, James said, very quietly, I'm not saying anything offensive. I'm saying what anyone who has worked in medicine long enough knows. She turned back to me. I'm sure in administration you see the same thing. People being placed in roles they haven't earned. Sometimes, I said. Dinner was called a few minutes later, and we moved to the dining room. The meal was genuinely good. Roast chicken with root vegetables, homemade bread, and a green salad with an apple cider dressing that had clearly been thought about. Robert opened a bottle of Ontario Riesling from Niagara. For a stretch, the conversation moved to easier ground. James and his father talked about hockey, the early Leaf season, the particular brand of optimism that afflicts Toronto fans every October. Patricia told a story about a trip she and Robert had taken to Prince Edward Island the previous summer. I listened and contributed and felt, briefly, like things might stay comfortable. But Patricia wasn't finished. You know what I find troubling, she said during a lull, cutting her chicken with the deliberate precision of someone returning to a thought they'd been holding, is that patients can no longer trust that the person in charge of their care has actually done the work. There used to be a standard. You knew the people at the top of cardiac surgery, for instance, had put in 20 years before anyone gave them that kind of responsibility. James set down his fork. People develop at different rates, I said, keeping my voice even. Patricia looked at me with something that wasn't quite condescension, but wasn't far from it. That's a very HR way of looking at it, she said, with respect. Robert looked at his plate. The heart doesn't care about optics, she continued. Cardiac surgery is not a place for learning on the job. When someone is on that table, you want the most experienced hands in the room, not the most recently promoted. You're absolutely right about that, I said. She paused, mildly surprised by my agreement. Well, yes. Experience in the operating room is irreplaceable, I continued, which is why I think about it every single time I scrub in. Patricia tilted her head slightly. Something in my phrasing had landed at an odd angle for her. She looked at James, who was very carefully examining his wineglass. You said she works in administration, Patricia said to him, not quite accusatory, but not that either. James put down his glass. I said she works in healthcare. You said administration. I may have been imprecise. Patricia looked back at me. What exactly do you do, Claire? I took a breath. I had not planned to say it the way it came out, but I also hadn't planned to wait any longer. I'm a cardiac surgeon, I said. I was appointed head of the cardiac surgery department at St. Michael's in Toronto about 3 weeks ago. The dining room did what dining rooms do in these moments. It went completely still. Robert set down his fork with a small, deliberate click. Patricia looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face yet, something between surprise and the slow, uncomfortable work of recalculation. St. Michael's, she said. Yes. The cardiac ward. Yes. A long pause. Outside, the wind moved through the bare maple in the front yard. Patricia looked at James. James looked at me. Robert appeared to be studying the grain of the tablecloth with great intensity. You're the new department head, Patricia said slowly. I am. Another silence. She reached for her wine glass and took a careful sip. I volunteer in that unit, she said, though I think she was mostly saying it to herself. I know, I said. James mentioned it. Patricia set down her glass. She did not look angry. She looked like someone doing the unpleasant work of replaying the last 40 minutes, and finding every sentence she had spoken sitting in a different light than it had when she said it. Robert cleared his throat. Well, he said, with the diplomatic neutrality of a man who has survived 35 years of marriage by knowing exactly when to say nothing useful, that is quite something. James finally spoke. I should have explained properly, Mum. That's on me. Patricia didn't answer him right away. She was still looking at me, and I could see something shifting behind her eyes, not softening exactly, but moving. The certainty that had been there all evening was gone, and what replaced it wasn't warmth yet. It was something more uncomfortable and more honest than warmth. It was recognition. I made some assumptions tonight, she said finally. That happens, I said. I made some statements. She paused. About young surgeons. You made statements about what good medicine requires, I said. Most of them weren't wrong. She looked at me sharply, as if expecting something else. I spoke about people being promoted beyond their experience. Yes. And you sat there. Yes. Patricia pressed her lips together briefly. Why? I thought about the question. Because you weren't talking about me specifically. You were talking about something you believe in. I didn't think correcting you mid-sentence was the right way to start getting to know each other. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. That was more generous than I deserved. Robert reached over and touched her hand briefly. She let him. Dinner continued after that, though the conversation was quieter and more careful than it had been. Patricia asked a few questions about my work. Real questions, not tests, and I answered them honestly. Robert told a long story about a hiking trip that went genuinely wrong somewhere in Algonquin Park, and by the time he got to the part about the canoe, James was laughing the way he laughs when he's actually relaxed, not performing relaxed but actually there. I watched Patricia while Robert told the story. She laughed in the right places, but every so often I could see her circling back, the way people do when something they've said is still working its way out of them. After dinner, while James and Robert did the dishes and the sound of running water and easy conversation drifted from the kitchen, Patricia and I ended up alone in the sitting room with tea. She sat across from me, her cup held in both hands, and for a few moments neither of us said anything. I've been a nurse for a long time, she said finally. I know, James told me. 32 years. She nodded. I saw a lot of changes in that time. Some of them good. Some of them I still have questions about. That's fair, I said. But I realized tonight that some of my questions have calcified into conclusions. She looked at me directly. That's not the same thing. No, I said. It isn't. Patricia set her cup down on the side table. I work in your unit every Thursday morning. I help with the family liaison program, speaking to the families of patients before and after procedures. She paused. I imagine we'll see each other. I imagine we will. She was quiet for a moment. I'd like that to not be awkward. It doesn't have to be, I said. She looked at me with something that was finally, clearly, an attempt at warmth. You're quite calm, she said. I don't mean it as a criticism. I know. It's actually somewhat unnerving. I smiled. I've been told. She almost smiled back. James appeared in the doorway and looked between us with the expression of someone expecting damage and finding the floor intact. Everything all right in here? We're fine, I said. Patricia looked at her son. You should have told me the truth, James. I know, Mum. I would have still been me, but at least I wouldn't have spent 40 minutes making a fool of myself. You weren't a fool, I said. She gave me a look that said she appreciated the sentiment but was not interested in being let off too easily. That look, actually, was the first moment I genuinely liked her. She called me 4 days later. I was finishing a chart review in my office when my assistant knocked and said there was a Patricia Holloway asking to speak with me, that she had my number from James. I told him to put her through. Dr. Mercer, she said. Claire is fine, I said. She seemed to consider that. Claire. A pause. I want to apologize properly. Not the way I did at dinner, which was more of an acknowledgement. A real apology. You don't need to. I do, she said firmly. I said things at that table that were dismissive of exactly the kind of surgeon you are. I made assumptions about your age, your gender, and what those things meant for your competence. I did that in front of my son, who loves you, and in front of my husband, who was clearly appalled at me, and most importantly, I did it in front of you. She paused. I'm sorry. The directness of it surprised me. I had been prepared for something softer, more qualified. I appreciate that, I said. I've been thinking, she continued, about what you said. That I wasn't talking about you specifically, that I was talking about something I believed in. You were right. But I also think I've been protecting that belief for so long that I stopped questioning whether it still reflected reality. Another pause. I came up in a system that didn't promote women easily. I watched a lot of qualified women get passed over, including myself, for positions that were given to men with half their experience. And somewhere along the way, I think I mistook the problem with the solution. I sat back in my chair. That was not a sentence I had expected. I started seeing youth and ambition as the problem, she continued, instead of the bias I was fighting against. And then a 32-year-old cardiac surgeon sat across from me at my own table, and I treated her like the system had treated me. That's worth naming. That is worth naming, I said. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately, she said. I just wanted you to know I understood what I did. I thought for a moment. My mother was a family physician in Halifax for 30 years, I said. She retired last year. She told me once that the hardest thing about medicine is holding on to humility at the same time as confidence. You need both, and they pull against each other. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's well put. She's a wise woman. She raised a cardiac surgeon, Patricia said. I'd say so. There was a warmth in her voice now that hadn't been there at dinner. Not performed. Not conciliatory. Just real. Would you be open? She said carefully. To having dinner again sometime? At the house. The same table. I'd like to start from a better place. I'd like that, I said. James said you like Indian food. I love Indian food. Robert has been perfecting his butter chicken for years. He would be deeply flattered. I smiled. Then yes. Definitely yes. We went back 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, the first snow of the season just beginning to settle on the Oakville streets as James and I pulled into the driveway. The maple in the front yard was bare now, its branches holding a thin crust of white. The porch light was on and I could see Robert through the front window, moving around the kitchen. James turned off the car but didn't open his door right away. He looked at me. Thank you for giving this another chance. Of course. No, he said. I mean genuinely. I handled the introduction badly, and then you carried the whole thing with more grace than I deserved. You were trying to protect something, I said. You just went about it the wrong way. I should have trusted her to handle the truth. Yes, I said, and you should have trusted me. He nodded. I know. A pause. I'm sorry. I looked at him for a moment. I know you are. I touched his arm briefly. Now let's go in. It's -7, and your father has apparently been working on butter chicken for 3 weeks. He laughed and we got out of the car. Patricia opened the door before we reached the porch, the same as last time, but the expression on her face was different. Open, a little careful, but genuinely warm. She hugged James and then turned to me and extended both hands. Not the brief, firm handshake from October, something more deliberate. Claire, she said. I'm glad you came back. So are we? I said. Robert called from the kitchen that dinner would be about 20 minutes and asked if James wanted to see what he'd done with the spice blend, which James absolutely did. Patricia and I moved into the living room. The Merck manual was still on the shelf. There was a new photo on the mantel, James and me at some point over the summer, laughing at something off camera, which meant she had put it there recently. She saw me notice it. He sent it to me last month, she said. I thought it belonged up there. I looked at it for a moment. Thank you. We sat down across from each other. Patricia poured tea from a pot that was already waiting, which meant she had timed it. That was the kind of detail that said more than words. I spoke to some of the other volunteers in the unit, she said. About you. She paused. The nurses who've worked with you. Oh? They spoke highly of you. She lifted her cup. Not because you're department head, because of how you are in the ward. One of the nurses said you remember every patient's name, that you always introduce yourself before explaining anything. That matters to people, I said. It does. Patricia held her cup for a moment. That's the part I was wrong about, you know. I thought experience and instinct were things that only came with decades. But what I was actually describing was character. And character doesn't have a schedule. I looked at her quietly. I spent 30 years learning that, she said, and then I forgot it for about 40 minutes in October. People are allowed to forget things, I said. She smiled slightly. You're generous. You came back from it clearly, I said. That matters more than the forgetting. From the kitchen came the sound of Robert explaining something at length about cardamom, while James made sounds of polite skepticism, and then laughter, and then the smell of something genuinely wonderful beginning to fill the house. Patricia looked toward the kitchen with an expression that was purely fond and said, He has been talking about this butter chicken since the moment I told him you were coming. That's very sweet. He'll want to know what you think. Be specific. He'll remember it. I laughed, noted. She looked back at me. There was a quiet between us now that was different from every quiet that had come before it. Not tense, not careful, just comfortable. The kind that takes time to build and means something once you have it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. That evening in October, when I was saying all of that, what were you thinking?" I considered the question. "Honestly? Please." "I was thinking that you reminded me of some of the attendings I had in residency," I said. "The ones who were the hardest on me. And I was thinking that those were also the ones who taught me the most." She looked at me steadily. "I didn't know you then." "No, but I could hear that you knew the work. Even when you were wrong about me, you weren't wrong about the work. That's actually not nothing." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I spent the last 30 years watching medicine change in ways that sometimes scared me. I watched the institution I gave everything to shift into something I didn't always recognize." She paused. "And then you walked into my house and made me feel like maybe it was in good hands after all." I didn't say anything right away. The snow outside had thickened slightly, the streetlight catching it as it fell, and the butter chicken smell from the kitchen had become something extraordinary. "I think it is," I said eventually. "In more than one set of hands." She nodded once, slowly. Robert appeared in the doorway with a kitchen towel over his shoulder, looking pleased with himself in the way. "Only people who have cooked something they're proud of look." "Right," he said. "I need someone to tell me if this needs more ginger before I plate it, and I am not asking James because he will say yes to be supportive regardless of whether it needs it." Patricia looked at me. "Duty calls." I stood up. "I take ginger very seriously," I said. "You have the right person." She stood up across from me and, briefly, she put a hand on my arm, just for a second. Then she let go and we walked toward the kitchen together, and behind us the snow continued to fall quietly over Oakville, and through the window the light was warm and steady, and for the first time since October, it felt like we were actually beginning. There's a particular kind of moment in medicine when a difficult case turns. You've been watching the numbers, adjusting, holding the thread, and then something shifts and you feel the room change around you. It's not dramatic. Nobody says anything. But you know it. That second dinner felt like that. People sometimes imagine that when someone underestimates you, the satisfying response is to prove them wrong loudly, to win in a way they can't ignore. I understand that impulse. I have felt it. But I have also spent enough time in operating rooms to know that the loudest moment is rarely the most important one. The important moments are quieter. They are the ones where someone sits across from you and does the hard work of changing their mind, and you meet that effort with something other than the anger you were entitled to carry. Patricia Holloway was not a cruel woman. She was a proud one, shaped by a career that had required her to fight for every inch of respect she received, and somewhere in that fight she had built walls that she'd stopped noticing were walls. She walked back from that faster and more honestly than a lot of people do. That deserves to be named. James told me later that his father had said I was the most composed person he had ever seen, and that Patricia had said she thought I would be good for James, but what she actually meant was that she thought I was good, full stop. Coming from her, he said, those were not small words. I thought about that on the drive home, the highway quiet at that hour, the snow still falling in the headlights, James with one hand on the wheel and the radio on low. Some people will always decide who you are before you get a chance to show them. That is not a solvable problem. What is solvable, slowly and imperfectly, is what happens after. Whether the person revises their picture or defends it, whether you extend them the room to change, or close the door before they get the chance. I have made mistakes in my career. I will make more. Every surgeon does, and learning to carry that without letting it hollow you out is its own kind of work. But I have never regretted choosing patience over retaliation. Not once. Not in a hospital, and not at a dinner table in Oakville, with snow on the maple and the smell of butter chicken coming from the kitchen, and a woman who had gotten me badly wrong working her way, honestly and without excuse, toward getting me right. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone had to adjust what they thought they knew about you, or when you had to do the harder thing and wait instead of react, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because those moments happen to all of us, and how we move through them says something about who we are that no title on a door ever could.